They called them invaders. They wrote them off as a footnote. They buried them beneath centuries of selective scholarship and colonial-era museum labels that turned conquerors into curiosities. But the record speaks for itself, if you're willing to listen. African kings, dark-skinned, Nubian kings from the land of Kush, sat on the throne of the most powerful civilization in the ancient world for 95 consecutive years. Not as puppets. Not as figureheads. As pharaohs. Supreme rulers. Divine kings of the two lands. They wore the double crown. They built the temples. They commanded the armies. They directed the priests and controlled the Nile. And when modern historians finally had to acknowledge it, they found a way to minimize it, distort it, and in some cases, erase it almost entirely. This is the story they didn't teach you in school. This is the story of the 25th dynasty of Egypt, and it begins in a kingdom most people have never heard of, in a land that changed the ancient world forever. To understand what happened around 747 BC, you need to understand the world as it existed. Egypt was fracturing. The New Kingdom's golden age, that era of Ramesses and Thutmose and towering imperial power, had collapsed nearly 3 centuries earlier. By the mid-8th century BC, Egypt was not one country, it was a patchwork of competing city-states, rival priests, warlords with local armies, and Libyan chieftains who had seized power in the north. The delta was controlled by a fragmented coalition of Libyan dynasties that had been ruling for over 200 years. Thebes, the sacred city of the god Demonios, was held by powerful priests and a warrior class that answered to no single authority. Egypt was weak, divided, and spiritually adrift. It was ripe for what was coming. To the south, in the region the ancient Egyptians called Toseti and the Greeks later named Nubia, sat the kingdom of Kush. Its capital was Napata, positioned just below the fourth cataract of the Nile in what is today northern Sudan. Kush was not a young civilization. It had been developing for centuries, accumulating gold, cattle, trade goods, military power, and, critically, a deep reverence for Egyptian culture, particularly the worship of Ammonius. The Kushites did not see themselves as outsiders to Egypt. They saw themselves as the true inheritors of its spiritual and political legacy. While Egypt had grown corrupt and divided, Kush had remained unified, disciplined, and devout. In their minds, marching north was not conquest. It was restoration. The man who began that march was King Kashta, who around 760 BC extended Kushite influence into Upper Egypt and installed his daughter as the divine adoratress of Ammonius at Thebes, one of the most powerful religious positions in all of Egypt. This was strategic brilliance. Without a single major battle, Kush had inserted itself into the spiritual heart of Egyptian power. But it was Kashta's son who would complete what his father started, and whose name deserves to be spoken with the same reverence we give to Alexander, to Caesar, to any conqueror history has chosen to celebrate. That man was Piye, also known as Piye, king of Kush, and soon to be pharaoh of all Egypt. Piye launched his northern campaign around 747 BC with an army that ancient sources suggest numbered in the tens of thousands. His forces were not undisciplined raiders. They were a professional, battle-hardened military force equipped with bronze weapons, trained cavalry, elite archers who were among the finest in the ancient world, and an organizational structure built through decades of Kushite state administration. When he moved north, he moved with the authority of a man who already believed the throne belonged to him. He was not taking Egypt. He was reclaiming it for Ammonius. He crossed the desert, advanced along the Nile, and met resistance from a coalition of northern rulers led by a Libyan chief named Tefnakti, who had been consolidating power across the delta and posed the most serious military threat to any southern advance. Piye defeated him. Then he defeated him again. Then he laid siege to Memphis, the ancient administrative capital of Egypt, a city of massive walls, dense population, and enormous symbolic weight. Memphis fell. Not through years of grinding siege warfare, but through a decisive assault that shattered the city's defenses in a single campaign. Piye entered Memphis like a pharaoh entering a temple he had built himself. He went directly to the sacred enclosure of Thor, the god of creation and craftsmanship, performed the proper ritual offerings, and presented himself not as a conqueror but as the rightful king fulfilling his divine obligation. This is documented in what scholars call the Victory Stele of Piye, a massive granite monument that Piye erected at the Temple of Ammonius at Gebel Barkor in Nubia. It is one of the longest and most detailed royal inscriptions from the ancient world, covering over 150 lines of hieroglyphic text. It describes the campaign in vivid detail, the battles, the negotiations, the cities that surrendered, the kings who bowed. It is primary historical evidence of remarkable quality. And for generations, it sat in museum collections as a curiosity rather than a centerpiece. Piye founded the 25th dynasty. After him came Shabaka, who consolidated Kushite rule across all of Egypt and initiated a major cultural and religious revival. Then came Shabitku, followed by Taharqa, one of the most extraordinary rulers in the history of the ancient world. Taharqa, who ruled from approximately 690 to 664 BC, expanded Kushite Egyptian power to an unprecedented scale. Ancient sources, including the Hebrew Bible in the Book of Kings, reference Taharqa as a major power who confronted the Assyrian Empire under Sennacherib. He is named in those texts as the king of Kush who came to the aid of Jerusalem. Consider what that means. This man's influence reached from deep in sub-Saharan Africa all the way to the Levant. He was a player in the geopolitics of the entire ancient Near East. Under Taharqa, Egypt saw a massive building program. He constructed or restored temples across the country, from the delta to deep in Nubia. At Karnak alone, he added a magnificent colonnade of enormous papyrus columns, some of which still stand today. He initiated building projects at Tanis, at Memphis, and more substantially at Napata and Meroe in his Kushite homeland. Trade under the 25th dynasty was extraordinary. Egypt's access to Nubian gold, which had historically been one of the greatest sources of wealth in the ancient world, was now fully integrated under a single political authority. We are talking about a gold-producing region that had been supplying the ancient world for over 1,000 years. Nubian gold had financed Egyptian temple complexes, military campaigns, and diplomatic exchanges for centuries. During the 25th dynasty, that gold flow was controlled entirely by Kushite kings. When Egyptian pharaohs sent diplomatic gifts to foreign powers, the gold those gifts were made from came through Kush. Contemporary estimates by economic historians suggest that the Nile Valley under the 25th dynasty represented one of the most concentrated nodes of agricultural and mineral wealth anywhere on Earth at that time, in a period when most of Western Europe was still operating in tribal, preliterate societies with no monumental architecture, no professional armies, and no state apparatus of any complexity. The Assyrian Empire ultimately forced the Kushites from Egypt. Beginning with the campaigns of Esarhaddon around 671 BC and continued by Ashurbanipal, who sacked the sacred city of Thebes in 663 BC, an event so shocking it reverberated across the ancient world and is referenced in the biblical book of Nahum, the 25th dynasty was pushed south. But even that ending deserves context. The Assyrian Empire at its height was arguably the most formidable military machine in the ancient world at that moment, fielding armies with iron weapons, sophisticated siege technology, and a brutal, methodical approach to warfare. Kush resisted them for decades. The last Kushite pharaoh, Tantemoni, actually retook Memphis briefly before the final Assyrian reconquest. They were not simply swept aside. They were overwhelmed by the single most powerful military force on Earth at the time, and they fought back until it was no longer viable to continue. Now here is where the story turns from history into something more uncomfortable. When colonial-era scholars began systematically organizing ancient history in the 19th century, they